We began last week studying Rambam's massive magisterial introduction to Mishnah. As you recall, Rambam wrote the first complete, comprehensive commentary to the entire book of Mishnah, all 63 books of Mishnah, and he begins with a fascinating, very long, and very sprawling introduction to Mishnah, but really to Torah and to oral Torah and to many other things. I put it in a word counter. How long is this introduction? It's more than 15,000 words, but it's an absolute classic work of Jewish and of Torah philosophy. And he started off last week with the origin of oral Torah. Torah was given in two formats: when God gave the Torah to Moshe, and when Moshe in turn conveyed the Torah to the nation. It was done with an oral format, with a written format, and that's the best, most optimal way of doing it. And he went through how it was taught. Moshe initially taught just to Aaron, and then Aaron sat to his right, and then Aaron's sons entered, and then the elders and the entire nation, and so on. And for 40 years, the nation was studying Torah, and at the end of Moshe's life, he had a month of clarification, of reminding anyone and clarifying for anyone what they may have missed, what they may have forgotten. And once Moshe passed, thus ended the era in which Torah was transmitted via prophecy. Once Moshe is no longer with us, we have all the tools to perpetuate the Torah just by ourselves, manually. Torah is no longer in the heavens, and thus even though prophecy outlasted Moshe for many centuries, almost 1,000 years after Moshe departs, we still have prophets. Prophecy ends towards the beginning of the Second Commonwealth. Nevertheless, prophecy is no longer an admissible argument when it comes to matter of Torah. In the words of the Rambam, the prophets, their arguments, their analyses of Torah, it's the same thing that the authors, that the architects of the Talmud do, thousands of years later. And we ended off last week, well, if prophecy is no longer, once Moshe passes, initially the Torah was all given via prophecy, but once Moshe passes, we no longer have prophecy as a method to clarify, to understand, to learn Torah. Well, what's the purpose of prophecy? Or what's the role of prophecy going forward? If it's not to give us the Torah or even to clarify the Torah for us, well, what's it for? And that leads us into the second section of the Rambam's massive magisterial introduction to Mishnah, and that's all about prophecy. And in this section, we will learn about, number one, the 4 different types of presumed prophecy. When someone comes as a prophet, you have to identify whether they're a real prophet or they are a false prophet. We've had lots and lots and lots of false prophets. How are you going to disprove that? First, you have to know which one of the 4 categories of presumed prophecy the prophecy claimant falls into. Only one of those 4 is legitimate. The other 3 are capital offenses. Once you know which bucket the potential prophet falls into, then you have to vet them. You have to determine whether or not they are legitimate. Well, what's the method for vetting prophets? And then he explains that there's a difference between real prophecy and false prophecy, because real prophecy is always precise. It's always astonishingly, completely precise, whereas false prophecy, maybe not so precise. And then he ends off by talking about the extent of allowable prophecy. How much can a prophet who fits into the 4th bucket, how much can they say that would alter, that would change the typical behavior that would otherwise be in place, absent said prophecy? And he ends off at the end, back to the core principle that prophecy, again, is inadmissible in the Torah debate. If there is a temporary need to change one part of the Torah, and he gives some examples of that, So long as it is not idolatry, then we must listen to the prophet. But in general, to prove a rule, a law, any sort of factor or variable in Torah, prophecy is not admissible. So he begins by saying, I see it's fitting in this introduction to talk about prophecy and how a prophet is examined, is investigated, is vetted whether they are real or not. We've had lots of claimants of prophets and prophecy. How do we know if someone's legit or they are fraudulent? And he begins by saying that there's a gross misconception in how prophecy is vetted. Many people, he says, like the entire masses, and even the small people, everyone seems to have this mistake, this misconception. They think that you can only vet a prophet once they do some miracle, once they do some sign that alters the state of nature, some nature-defined miracle, then I believe. After all, Elijah revived the dead. Elisha did the same. All the miracles that Moshe did, pretty impressive. All the water is now blood, and the staff is now a snake, and the frogs, and all the 10 plagues, splitting the sea. Like, this is unbelievable, bringing us the manna. Those miracles, says the Rambam, all happened after they were vetted as prophets. This is not the bar that's needed for a prophet to prove their legitimacy. What those aforementioned prophets did not prove their prophecy bona fides. They were already established as legitimate prophets beforehand. So how do we understand miracles done by prophets? We understand it that, the Rambam explains, that they had a specific need, and because they were so close and cherished by God, God agreed to bend nature to follow their will. So normally, as in the case of the dead boys in Elijah and Elisha's case, once someone's dead, they're dead. They'll be resurrected, but that's a separate discussion. Well, the prophet wants that to change. Nature is subject to change when the prophet requests it. So that's not what proved their legitimacy. So how is their legitimacy proved if you don't need to alter nature? So he says, well, first, I'll tell you the answer in a second. But first, we have to know which type of prophet we're talking about. When we're talking about prophecy, you have to know that there are 4 different types of prophets. 2 who prophesy in the name of an idol, and 2 who prophesy in the name of God. Only one of those 4 is legitimate. The first type of prophet, so to speak, who prophesies in the name of an idol, imagine you have a quote-unquote prophet, and he says, this star, this constellation, told me, he endowed me with his spirit, and he told me, worship me in this manner, and I will answer you. And he gets people to go follow him. Or he calls people and says, well, let's go worship Baal, or this idol, or that idol. Because they told me, and they commanded me, and they instructed me to do their service. So obviously that's a false prophet, because it's a prophecy for idolatry, which is false. That's the first category of idolatrous prophecy. The second category of idolatrous prophecy is a little bit more subtle. That's when a person says, oh, Almighty God commanded me to worship Baal, or to worship some angel or some heavenly force. Oh, and this is actually a legitimate form of service as commanded in the Torah. So this prophet, so to speak, is claiming that he's speaking on behalf of God, on behalf of the Torah. But it is still idolatrous prophecy. And obviously, that is not legitimate. Now, what happens to these two quote-unquote prophets? When we hear a quote-unquote prophecy from one of these two types of false prophets, and we have witnesses, they are executed. This is a capital offense. The verse tells us in Devarim, in Deuteronomy chapter 13, that prophet, so to speak, or that seer, or that dreamer, shall be executed. We don't say, wait a minute, let's see the evidence. Let's vet them. Let's find some proof. Is he real or is he not? No. Because he fits into those two buckets, those two categories, he is executed before we even asked him for that. That's not a legitimate prophecy. That's not within the bounds of legitimate prophecy, and therefore that is necessarily, inherently a false prophet, and he is executed. But what if he does a miracle? We don't ask him for a miracle. What if he does it? He does a sign. Something miraculous. He's walking on water. Oh, we don't know how he did that. We don't listen to that. Yes, there's a suspension of nature. So what? And the Rambam cites the verse again in Devarim chapter 13, verse 4. There will be prophets, so to speak, false prophets, idolatrous prophets, who will do miracles. The Torah tells us this ahead of time. Don't listen. Don't turn to their signs, their wonders, their miracles, because the verse tells us God is testing you. The quote-unquote proof, it's a test. Yes, they defy nature. And they're still a false prophet. They're still an idolatrous prophet, and they still must be executed. And in the next line, Rambam says something very interesting. When we see a miracle, we don't know how that happened. We see a miracle. That gets our attention. David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear. That's a miracle. How did he do it? We don't know. Actually, we do know. The people who were there were on a platform that was moving very slowly, that was imperceptible. And of course, there were curtains on either side. So then realize that they're moving, and then you open up the back curtain. Oh, it's gone. What happened? Oh, you're off a little bit. Anyhow, but we see a miracle. Our eyes are like absolutely wowed. How did that happen? So the unsophisticated person may say, well, we must just follow this person, their divine nature. We have to just follow whatever they say. Says the Rambam, our intelligence, our logic, that is stronger proof than our eyes, who are wowed and mystified by his miracle. And there were already very wonderful and great miracles, greater miracles, done by Moshe, done by others, that commanded us to serve only one God, the God who effectuated all existence, the God who has all greatness and all powers coalesced in one. So we're talking about vetting a potential prophet. And we find that, at least up to this point, there are two types of prophecy that we don't even consider vetting, because we know for sure that they are idolatrous prophets. It's a capital offense. Okay, well, what about the other two types of prophets? The two who claim to speak in the name of God. The first category is someone who prophesies in the name of God. And he calls out to people to believe in him. And he commands upon the service of God. So it sounds like this person is saying, oh, only one God, only Torah. We're not founding another religion. But then he says, God commanded me to tell you that there's actually 614 mitzvos. There's one more mitzvah that he forgot to tell Moshe. Or there's one mitzvah that is no longer relevant. 612. And then he adds, very crucial point, there is no difference if he tells or if he professes to add or subtract in the written Torah or the oral Torah. If he takes any part of the body of Torah, the corpus of Torah given to us by Moshe, written and oral, and he says, oh, we're changing it, God commanded me to change it, that, again, is a false prophet. And he gives examples. The example of Arla. Arla is the law of a fruit-bearing tree. For the first 3 years, you cannot eat from the fruits. 4th year is not to revai, and then from then on, you eat it. He says, no, it's 2 years, or it's 4 years. So he's changing a law of the Torah. The verse tells us, in Leviticus chapter 19, the laws of Arla, you want to change it? You're professing to speak in the name of God? This is not legitimate. You're professing to speak in the name of God, and you're changing the oral Torah based upon prophecy. That was done only once, only by Moshe. Only Moshe is the giver of Torah via prophecy. Once that era ended, there is no longer a way to impact Torah via prophecy. Again, we have other ways. We talked about the 13 methods of derivation. We talked about the idea of the sages disputing and so on. And we'll get to that, of course, in more detail. But prophecy is no longer an admissible means to impact Torah. And this person is also guilty of a capital offense. This person is also a false prophet. But he did miracles. It doesn't matter. Again, we're being tested. Oh, and his miracles carry no water when compared to Moshe's miracles. And he cites the verse in chapter 19. This is right before the sign of revelation. The purpose of the sign of revelation, V'gam b'cha ya'aminu le'olam. In Moshe, they will forever believe. The primacy, the supremacy of Moshe's prophecy, of Mosaic prophecy, will remain unchallenged forever. And Moshe himself, he told us, there's not going to be a second Torah. The Torah is no longer in the heavens. He commanded us not to tinker with the Torah, to tamper with it, not to add and not to subtract. Once Moshe has passed, Ein navi rashai l'chadash av ma'ata. A prophet cannot innovate, cannot bring something new, cannot add anything new once Moshe has passed. Now again, there are things that the sages can add. There's rabbinic law, which is a separate discussion. But to change the Torah, and a prophet who does that is a false prophet, so we're 0 for 3. There are 3 types of prophets who are executed before they even get a chance to be inspected, to be vetted. And here comes the 4th category of prophecy. Someone who calls people to serve Hashem, to serve God. Someone who commands upon the mitzvah of God. Someone who is very careful and warns to observe the Torah without adding and without subtracting. And he cites as an example the final prophet, the last prophet our nation had, the prophet Malachi. He ends off his work, so this is the last work of prophets in our set of prophets in Tanakh. Zichru Torahs Moshe Avdi, remember the Torah of Moshe. So the prophet's coming to reinforce the Torah of Moshe, not to change it. And the prophet will promise reward for those who fulfill the Torah, will promise punishment for those who disobey it. And that's the bread and butter of prophets. That's what Isaiah did, Jeremiah did, Ezekiel did. So this is the only acceptable category of prophecy. Someone comes to reinforce the Torah, to maybe tell us the consequences thereof, but not coming to change it at all. But still, a real prophet, can give us instructions and can tell us things that are not in the Torah. He gives an example. Wage war against this city or this country, as Saul did. Is that in the Torah? No, it's not. Is that a violation of the Torah? Also not. It's not mentioned in the Torah. The prophet says to do it. We must listen to them. Elisha tells Yehoram, don't kill some troops, the troops of Aram. Not in the Torah. Well, the prophet says, you must listen, obey, adhere to the prophet. Isaiah prevented water from being brought inside the wall, Isaiah 22. Jeremiah, don't come back to the land of Israel before 70 years have elapsed after the destruction. The prophet is claiming prophecy, is not attributing it to idolatry, is not adding nor subtracting the Torah. So this is the permissible bucket. This is the allowable prophecy. So we need to test them. We have to vet them. We have to inspect them. We have to find out. Okay, the category of prophecy is okay, but is this person real, or are they fraudulent? Are they a hoax? Is this legit, or is this chicanery? If he is legit, we must follow him. And we cannot deviate from his instructions, not a little bit, not in a great matter, not in a small matter. And in fact, disobeying the prophet is a capital offense. So if he's a real prophet, we have to listen to them. And if he's a false prophet, we have to execute him as well. Because even though someone is claiming in an allowable domain of prophecy, if he's making it up, well, that too is a false prophet. So how is he vetted? Now the Rambam, very interesting, before he even describes the process of vetting, he says the first thing is the person needs to be a worthy person. He has to be wise. If you're not wise, you're not a candidate. He has to be an ascetic, someone who withdraws from the mundane and the base. He has to have beautiful, resplendent character. He has to be an intelligent person. He has to be exceedingly humble. And then the Rambam says, and there's many, many, many other characteristics that are needed just before a person's even examined. Are they such a person who would be worthy of prophecy? In the general world, there's an attitude that prophecy is a form of a spiritual lottery, where anyone can, God spoke to me. Doesn't work like that. Prophecy is a level that someone earns with their greatness, their wisdom, their dedication, their devotion, their commitment, their faith, their righteousness, their holiness, their piety. So if someone just says, I woke up and I'm a prophet, we know without even inspecting them that they're not a prophet. They're a false prophet. Unless they are absolutely renowned as a person of immense greatness. And the Rambam says there's many, many more necessary prerequisites for prophecy, and maybe I'll write a book on it. That's what he says. Maybe I'll write a book. V'ulai Hashem Yisayenu. This is it was written originally in Arabic, but this is the official sanctioned translation that was done already in his time. V'ulai, maybe Hashem will help us, and we'll write down we'll write down, we'll codify all the things, all the prerequisites of prophecy. Okay. So once a person we know is worthy of prophecy, we asked him to tell us what God had told him, meaning we asked him to tell us the future. Tell us what's going to happen. Tell us what God tells you. And if it comes true, well, then we know that maybe your prophecy is true. And if it does not come true, or even if it's only partially true, if there's even something, a slight bit off from what you claimed and what happened, we know for sure that he is a false prophet. Quotes the verse, Deuteronomy chapter 18, that describes this process. We vet them. We ask them to foretell the future. Not once, not twice, many times. We test him again and again, repeatedly, time after time, to clarify, is this person legit? Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet, was legit, and he was tested repeatedly. And the Rambam cites the verses. Everyone in the entire nation, V'yeda Kol Yisrael, the whole nation knew that he was a true, trustworthy prophet to God. Everyone knew that he was a legitimate prophet because he was tested again and again and again and again. And once they had a prophet in their midst, every question would come to his door. There was nothing that they wouldn't ask the prophet. And if that was not the case, the Rambam has a very interesting proof here. When Samuel, when he coronated Saul as king, they met because Saul was looking for his donkeys that were lost. Well, what do? So we look at the video camera, right? Look at the ringed camera. Where'd they go? Now they have these little pins, little tags that are a GPS. Make sure you keep a tag in the satchel so you could hunt down your donkeys. Samuel was the source for all sorts of questions. And Saul went to him to find his lost items. And Samuel revealed to him where his items were. And that's the best proof of the role that the prophets had and the reliability that they had, the credibility that they had amongst the nation. Everyone knew that this person was a legitimate prophet, and everyone would ask their questions to him. Now, this is a very interesting idea. We think of a prophet as something so lofty and so elevated and so holy. Why would we trouble the prophet with our little petty mundane things? It seems like it's maybe an inappropriate way to utilize prophecy. Maybe we shouldn't do that. You have your own petty needs. You're going to go to the prophet. So the Rambam, this is a very interesting idea that he says. I believe this is also a little controversial. He cites the verse where in the book of Devarim, much of the book of Devarim is warning us against falling prey to the idolatrous ways of the Canaanites that we're about to enter the land. But it describes the Canaanites as stargazers, as necromancers, as sorcerers, as prognosticators. They would go to the Me'onanim and the Kosmim, all these different types of clairvoyance. And the verse says, Hashem gave us real prophets so that we don't have to go to all those fake clairvoyants. And thus the Rambam says, well, if having a prophet is such a benefit and it's an alternative to all the other false means of prognostication that the idolaters use, it must be that it's available for us in all sorts of needs that we may have. Instead of going to the necromancer and the sorcerer, go to the prophet. Even if it means, or even if the only subject in question is, well, where do I find my lost items? Now, of course, there's a difference. between real prophets and fortune tellers and soothsayers and necromancers in that our prophets are real, are legit, and are always 100% accurate. Whereas someone who has a sixth sense and some sort of way to foretell the future, they may have something, and we don't know where that comes from, but they may have something, but it's not 100% accurate. And we don't know where it comes from or what sort of damage comes with that information that they are conveying to us. And then he ends off by saying, this is why a prophet is called a seer, a roa asidos. He sees the future before it happens. And then he explains, so what's the difference between sorcerers and fortune tellers and clairvoyants and prophets? I'll explain to you. It's a big topic. When a prophet, false prophet, a seer, a fortune teller, a sorcerer, a necromancer, when they foretell the future, some of it will be true, some of it will be a lie. He's not saying, by the way, that they don't have anything. He's accepting that there's something there. There are people who are endowed with some sixth sense. But necessarily, because it's not prophecy, some of their words may be true, and some will necessarily be false. And their only difference over, so to speak, a layperson is the rate of falsehood is less. Most people, it's like 50-50, right? It's a coin flip to predict the future. Them, it's 90-10 maybe, or 85-15. But it's not really telling us the future. There's all sorts of imprecisions. They have a lower error rate, but it's not actually accurate. And he gives an example. He says, if a soothsayer, fortune teller says, well, this year will be a famine. There won't be any rain. The second one raindrop falls, it's a false prophecy. They said there won't be any rain, and there was rain. He says, well, tomorrow it's going to rain. We've had a drought for a long time. Tomorrow it's going to rain. It doesn't rain tomorrow. It rains the next day. So we would say, it's good enough. It's close enough. That's not real prophecy. The foretelling of true prophets is 100% accurate. It's got to be astonishingly accurate. Nothing big or small will be left empty. He compares it to a granary. You have grain, but there's also chaff and straw. So there's usually a mix. So a true prophet will have just grain, just truth, and not even one drop of straw. Whereas the false prophets or other fortune tellers, necromancers, soothsayers, and the like, they'll always have at least a little bit of straw with their grain, and most likely it'll just be a few granules of grain amidst all the straw. And he cites the Talmud. The Talmud tells us, just as you cannot find grain without straw, a dream that may be a vehicle for some sort of out-of-body, supernatural revelation of sorts, a dream will always have something false in it. There'll always be something nonsensical about it. It's not real prophecy in that it must necessarily have something in it that is not accurate. And therefore, we have someone who fits into the correct category, the correct bucket of prophecy. We have to vet them repeatedly, and it has to be only grain, only truth, no falsehood. And then he adds a qualifier. A prophet who is foretelling the future can be inaccurate and still be true. A prophet could say something and it just does not happen. And nevertheless, their legitimacy, their credibility, their reliability, their veracity as a prophet remains unchallenged. When a prophet foretells something negative, some doomed catastrophe that will happen, and it doesn't happen. Tomorrow there will be a volcano that will destroy the whole land. Very unfortunate. Tomorrow, nothing happens. The day comes and goes peaceably. You and I may think, well, this is a false prophet. This does not disprove this prophet. And we don't say that he's a false prophet that needs to be executed, because all negative, harmful, injurious prophecies are subject to revocation, because God can forgive. We could do tshuva, we could repent. God, when he tells something negative, that can be undone. Maybe they repented, or maybe God delayed it. God, in his mercy and benevolence, delayed it. And there's many examples that he cites to this effect. And therefore, when a negative tiding does not happen, that does not disprove the veracity of the prophet. But if the prophet foretells something positive, in this year will be a year of quiet and peace and harmony without any war, or he says this year will be very well irrigated, lots of rain, lots of blessing, and then the year was not good, it was not peaceable, there were wars, it was not healthy and robust, there was famine and hunger, then we know for sure this is a false prophet, and he is a liar, and we should not be scared of him, as the verse tells us. Don't be terrified of him, don't have any dread of him, don't withhold from executing him, because he is a false prophet. For when God promises positive tidings, it's not possible for that to be a true prophecy and not to happen. Cites the Talmud to this effect. Kol davar, everything that comes out of the mouth, so to speak, of God for good, for positivity, even if it was conditional and the conditions were not met, nevertheless, God will not revoke that. Then he asks a very, very sharp question, because he's like studying this whole subject from all sorts of different angles. When Jacob was fleeing from his brother, and he stops off and has the dream with the ladder suspended, the angels go up and down, God promised him, I will be with you, I will guard you in all that you do. And yet, 20 years later, when he's returning, he's fearful. He's fearful. Maybe Esav will do damage to him. So the Rambam explains, and this needs some clarification. Jacob was concerned that maybe he had a sin that will cause him to die. Shema yigrom hachet, the Talmud tells us. Maybe sin will cause the bad things to happen. And he explains that when the Almighty promises goodness, and then there's just an abundance of sins, then the goodness may not happen. The goodness may not happen. And then he clarifies the critical point. There's a difference between prophecy that's pertaining to the prophet himself and prophecy that pertains to everyone else. This idea that some abundance of sins can uproot a good tidings from God, it's only when it applies to the prophet himself. So Jacob received the prophecy, God said, I'll protect you, I'll save you, I'll be with you, you'll come back safely. And now Jacob is worried. Maybe a sin will happen and I'll die. Maybe there's an abundance of sins and I'll die. But wait a minute, the good prophecy always comes true. Yes, but when the prophecy was pertaining not to others but to the prophet himself, then a sin can uproot it. Whereas when a prophet is told to tell others about good things that will happen, and then those good things do not happen, we know for sure this is a false prophet. It's not possible. When prophecy is conveyed to others and it's a positive prophecy, then it will definitely happen. And if it doesn't, we know that the quote-unquote prophet is actually a false prophet. And he cites an example here, or a hint, of Jeremiah and the false prophets in his day. Jeremiah prophesied doom and destruction and devastation and death. He prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar, that the Babylonians will grow strong and mighty and will destroy the temple. And there were false prophets in his day who prophesied in the opposite direction. Oh, all the temple vessels that were plundered will come back to Jerusalem. And there will be goodness and peace and security and stability in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah told him that if his prophecy will not come true, and if Nebuchadnezzar will not destroy the temple, and in fact, the vessels of the temple will come back, if your prophecy comes true, it will not disprove my prophecy, because maybe the Almighty will have mercy and compassion upon us. But if your prophecy doesn't come true, if the temple is destroyed, if my prophecy does come true, then you for sure are a false prophet, because good tidings will necessarily happen, again, when they're conveyed to others. And he cites some scriptural verses to this effect. When a prophet foretells good and bad, that is not the same when it comes to vetting the prophet. When it's a bad prophecy, we cannot prove one way or another. Only from a good prophecy, a prophecy foretelling good things, only then can a prophet be vetted. Once a prophet is proven to be legitimate, then we must listen to them. And they have the right and the ability to tell us something about the Torah that no one else does. They can nullify a mitzvah, or they can permit a transgression temporarily. If I come, a nonprofit organization, if I come and I say, well, this mitzvah no longer applies, or this prohibition no longer applies, that's not at all acceptable. But if a prophet comes and says, this mitzvah temporarily will not apply, this transgression will temporarily not apply, we are obligated to listen to him. And if someone doesn't listen to them, it's a capital offense. Now, it's a capital offense not adjudicated by the court, but by heaven. And there are two exceptions. Exception number one is idolatry. Idolatry will never, ever, ever be permitted. Not temporarily, not permanently. So if one of the laws that the prophet wants to temporarily suspend relates to idolatry, that is not legitimate. If the prophet wants to uproot a mitzvah, be it a positive mitzvah, a performative mitzvah, be it a negative mitzvah, a prohibition, and he wants to do that permanently, again, not admissible. Only temporarily and only so long as it's not related to idolatry. Now, again, he stresses that if you were to ask the prophet himself, well, wait a minute, you're telling us to violate this law? You're telling us to, he gives an example a little later on. He says, Elijah on Mount Carmel, he's having the showdown with the prophets of the Baal. And he brings a sacrifice outside of Jerusalem, outside of the temple. The verse tells us, Devarim chapter 12, you cannot do that. If it's a temple, Jerusalem, it's selected, there's the active temple, that's where sacrifices are brought, there and nowhere else. So that's another verse that talks about how terrible it is to offer a sacrifice outside of the proper location. Someone who does that is guilty of a crime that has within it the penalty of kares, of spiritual excision, of spiritual disenfranchisement from the entire nation. How did Elijah do it? He's a prophet. He suspended a transgression temporarily. And again, he would explain that the Almighty told him, in order to disprove the false prophets, there is a temporary suspension of that law. Elisha, in the book of Kings 2, he tells us to knock down fruit-bearing trees. In violation of Devarim chapter 20, do not destroy fruit-bearing trees. A prohibition is being suspended temporarily for a purpose. The prophet, we have to listen to him. He gives an example. Suppose there's a prophet who's been vetted. And he tells us on Shabbos, the holy Shabbos, make a fire and make weapons and take those weapons and go to that city and wage war against that city. We are obligated to listen to him, to violate the Shabbos. And we're obligated by the Torah given to us by Moshe. We have to get up right away and not delay or tarry at all. And to do it all with alacrity and with joy. Without any doubts, without any delays. Even though it's the holy Shabbos, and doing work on Shabbos is a violation of a capital offense, we should do it with hope and anticipation we'll be rewarded for doing a mitzvah. It is a mitzvah to listen to the prophet. Elav tishma'un, to him you shall heed. You must listen to the prophet. Again, so long as it's not idolatry, and so long as it is not permanent, it's temporary. And if a person says, oh, I want to observe the Shabbos. I'm a righteous person. I'm fearful of God. Oh, and I'm old. I'm not going to go to war. I'm not a war-fighting age. Everyone else will do it. I'll keep the Shabbos. After all, how can I get up on Shabbos and to violate the capital offense of Shabbos? To go do war? I can't even change it. I'm not going to improve the state of the war-fighting condition, not to make it worse. There will be others to do the war on my behalf. This person is a rebel, and he is violating the word of God, and he is guilty of repudiating the prophecy. And this is a capital offense. Again, not listening to the prophet is a capital offense, not adjudicated by the human court, but by the heavenly court. God, the same God who commanded us on Shabbos, commanded us on listening to the prophet, and the prophet and the person who does not listen to the prophet, Anochi edrosh mi'imo, I will demand the punishment from him. Now again, the prophet told us to violate the Shabbos to do war. What if the guy wants to check his stocks? So I don't know, make a knot. Makes a knot. That's not needed for the war fighting effort. Such a person is still violating the Shabbos. The permissibility when a prophet comes and tells us to violate the Shabbos, it's only for the purposes and within the confines of what he clarified. Something which is not needed for the war fighting effort, that would still be prohibited. Shabbos in its place remains. This is a legitimate statement of a prophet. But if the prophet switches one little drop of Shabbos permanently, he says, for example, the Tchum Shabbos, which means the boundaries within a city, you're allowed to walk on Shabbos. Outside the city, there's only 2,000 cubits in every direction. Otherwise, you cannot tread past that 2,000 cubit mark. And the prophet says, it's not 2,000 cubits, it's 1999 or 2001. And how do you know that? Well, this is prophecy. God told me that you got it wrong. It's not 2,000 amos, not 2,000 cubits, it's 2001. They're using prophecy to change a part of Torah permanently. This is a false prophet, and he is executed. Prophets have no advantage over anyone else when it comes to matter of the Torah. Again, that was done only once. There's only one prophet who used prophecy to teach Torah. That's only Moshe. And he vacated heaven from Torah. Torah is no longer in the heavens. And therefore now, prophecy is no longer admissible. And again, the examples in which the prophet can change a law, it's only temporarily, it's only not idolatry, it's only after they have been vetted. But they're not saying that they're changing the Torah, they're saying that there's a certain circumstance that warrants a mitzvah or a prohibition being temporarily suspended. When it comes to Torah, we have tools, we have analysis, we have argumentation, we have logic. There are ways that we can engage with Torah, not prophecy. And therefore, if you have 1,000 prophets and they all argue X, and you have 1,001 sages, not prophets, and they argue Y, it's 1,000 prophets. When it comes to determining Torah law, prophecy is not an admissible means. And therefore, we follow the majority, and the majority of 1,001 will trump the majority or the minority of 1,000 prophets, honorable, revered prophets. But still, prophets cannot use that authority to impose their will. And he cites some very interesting teachings in the Talmud. One of the sages said, I promise if Joshua comes to me right now and he tells me from his own mouth that the law is X, I will not listen to him. A second teaching, if Elijah comes, the prophet, and he tells me that the chalitza process is done with this type of shoe, not that type of shoe, we don't listen to him. Once Moshe has passed, we do not add, we do not subtract from the Torah via prophecy in any manner. And again, if a prophet testifies that the Almighty God told him that the law in a certain mitzvah is such, or that the argument of one group is greater than the argument of the other group, it's more true, that prophet is a false prophet, and he is executed. And he ends off the last paragraph of this section. After the first prophet, after Moshe, the Torah is given. You cannot add, you cannot subtract. It is no longer in the heavens. And prophets have no benefit, have no power in matters of Torah. Again, not the circumstances when, for a specific reason, it's temporarily changed or suspended. But for the laws of the Torah, prophets have no power over the sages, over those who make cogent arguments. The verse does not say, when you have a doubt, when you have an uncertainty, when you have a dilemma, you go to the prophet. It says you go to the priests, to the Levites, to the judge. They're the ones who clarify matters of Torah. Prophecy is no longer a means to adjudicate the words of Torah. thus concludes this section of Rambam's introduction to Mishnah as it relates to prophecy. There are 4 different types of presumed prophecy. 2 in the name of idolatry, 2 in the name of God, but only 1 of them is legitimate. The rest of them are capital offenses. Once someone indeed falls into the category that is admissible, we have to vet them. And there's a difference between the prophets and the clairvoyants and the necromancers, and their ilk in that prophecy must always be precise. And there's a difference between a positive prophecy, a prophecy foretelling something positive, versus something negative. It is allowed for a prophet who has been proven to temporarily add or subtract, provided it's not in idolatry and provided that it's not permanent. Elijah can bring the offering on Mount Carmel. Elisha can command to uproot fruit trees. In the event that a prophet comes and tells us we have to wage war on Shabbos, we must listen to him. But the core principle, the Torah is now in our hands, and it's not in the hands of the prophets. And prophecy is inadmissible in the Torah debate. That is the central point that he's trying to convey. And I think, there is a very long piece, this subsection about prophecy. I think it fits into the introduction to oral Torah because it explains what's at stake. And it sheds light on the whole history of oral Torah. We have absolutely no fallback. There's no way for us to say, we'll have a prophet. It's just a safety measure to ensure that if you ever go awry, you can just call it in, right? We don't have that. And that was reinforced to the nation. Moshe passes and that's it. No longer is Torah in the heavens. From then on, it's only in our hands. And that, of course, reinforces the imperative to make sure that we do the absolute best job that we possibly can do. And that explains the whole history of the transmission and the clarification of Torah in the aftermath of Moshe's passing. Our sources document for us that when Moshe passed, many laws were forgotten. Hundreds of laws, thousands of laws were forgotten. And the people wanted to kill Joshua. And they said to him, go ask God. You're a prophet after all. Go ask God. And Joshua said, sorry. It's not a legitimate way to access Torah anymore. Those laws were recovered. How were they recovered? In the means of debate, of analysis, of logical argumentation, in the means that are present in this world to determine and to clarify the Torah. We will continue. Please God, we have many more sessions to go in the study of this wonderful and absolutely authoritative introduction to Mishnah. We've seen many parts of it before, but this is the Rambam's amazing magisterial work that he finds fitting to read before you read the Mishnah, before you learn oral Torah. Know what it's about, know the history, know the components, know the structure, know the sequencing, know, of course, today we learned to know about where and when and how prophecy can and may not be presented, how it's vetted, how it's clarified, what a prophet can impose and what a prophet cannot do. Torah is no longer in the heavens. I appreciate your attention on this matter, in this subject. I'd love to hear your questions, your comments, and your feedback. As always, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.